Bangladesh is a country of about 170 million people, those people living in an area a little smaller than the US state of Illinois, a hair over 57,000 square miles, which is about 147,000 square kilometers. It shares a smallish southeastern border with Myanmar, and its entire southern border runs up against the Bay of Bengal, which is part of the Indian Ocean, but it's surrounded to the west, north, and most of its eastern border by India, which nearly entirely encompasses Bangladesh due to the nature of its historical formation. Back in 1905, a previously somewhat sprawling administrative region called Bengal, which has a lot of history of human occupation and development, and which for the past several hundred years leading up to that point had been colonized by various Europeans, was carved out by the British as a separate province, newly designated Eastern Bengal and Assam, at the urging of local Muslim aristocrats who were playing ball with then governing British leaders, the lot of them having worked together to make the region one of the most profitable in British India, boasting the highest gross domestic product and the highest per capita income on the subcontinent at the time. This division separated Bengal from its Hindu-dominated neighboring provinces, including nearby and booming Calcutta, which was pissed at this development because it allowed the British to invest more directly and lavishly in an area that was already doing pretty well for itself, without risking some of that money accidentally overflowing into nearby Hindu areas like, for instance, Calcutta. This division also allowed local Muslim leaders to attain more political power, in part because of all that investment, but also because it freed them up to form an array of political interest groups that, because of the nature of this provincial division, allowed them to focus on the needs of Muslim citizens and to counter the influence of remaining local Hindu landowners and other such folks who had previously wielded an outsized portion of that power. These leaders were redistributing power in the region to Muslims over Hindus, basically, in contrast to how things had worked previously. In 1935, the British government promised to grant the Bengalese government limited provincial autonomy as part of a larger effort to set the subcontinent out on its own path, leading up to the grand decolonization effort that European nations would undergo following World War II. And though there was a significant effort to make Bengal its own country in 1946, post-war, and just before the partition of British India, that effort proved futile, and those in charge of doing the carving up instead divided the country into areas that are basically aligned with modern-day India and modern-day Pakistan, but 2/3 of Bengal were given to Pakistan, while 1/3 was given to India. This meant that a portion of Pakistan, the most populous portion, though with a smaller land area, was separated from the remainder of the country by Indian territory. And the logic of dividing things in this way was that the British wanted to basically delineate Hindu areas from Muslim areas, and while large spread out groups of Muslims lived roughly within the borders of modern-day Pakistan, a large, more densely crowded group of Muslims lived in Bengal, hence the otherwise nonsensical seeming decision to break a country up into two pieces in this way. Frictions developed between mainland Pakistan and the portion of Pakistan formerly Bengal that was initially called East Bengal and then renamed East Pakistan in 1955. Those frictions developed almost immediately. There was a movement to get the Bengali language officially recognized as a state language, alongside Urdu, which was promoted as the exclusive federal language of Pakistan early on. And a list of 6 demands were presented to the Pakistani government by East Pakistan-based politicians, all of which aimed to get the region equal representation in what they felt was a West Pakistan-biased system, despite the fact that, again, East Pakistan, formerly Bengal, was the most populous part of the country, and they had the most thriving economy as well, bringing in most of the country's income. These demands led to what's become known as the 6 Points Movement, which in turn, just a few years later, kicked off the Bangladesh War of Independence, which was exactly what it sounds like, an effort by folks in East Pakistan to achieve independence from the larger government of Pakistan, which had in recent years been taken over by a military junta, which, like the previous government, did not give as much political power to East Pakistanis. That junta, in late March of 1971, launched a military operation called Operation Searchlight that was meant to take out separatists in East Pakistan. But in practice, this meant they swooped in and started killing academics, members of the local intelligentsia, and people of Hindu faith, alongside members of the rabble-rousing groups that were petitioning for more power in this smaller by landmass but larger by population and income segment of the country. Operation Searchlight sparked the aforementioned Bangladesh War of Independence, and 9 months later, the military government's efforts during this conflict were deemed to be genocidal because of how they targeted ethnic Bengalis, killing somewhere between 300,000 and 3 million of them, while also intentionally and systematically raping hundreds of thousands of Bengali women. The soldiers who committed these acts doing so with the formal go-ahead from their government. They were told to do this, basically. These atrocities eventually pulled India into the conflict, in part because millions of Bengalis were fleeing across their border to escape the genocide, and in part because the genocide was occurring to begin with. And that sparked the 1971 Indo-Pakistani War, which eventually ended that genocide when Pakistan's government surrendered at the tail end of 1971. That victory led to, formerly Bengal, then East Pakistan, now Bangladesh's independence from Pakistan. It also concretized India's military dominance in the region, and Pakistan, what remained of it, lost more than half its population, much of its economic base, and it suffered a long period of embarrassment that left it questioning the basis of its militant, braggadocious approach to both nationalism and foreign policy. It was previously a pretty well-respected and feared military force, but it became a somewhat eyes-downcast, embarrassed entity in the region for a while. Lots of reforms eventually helping it shore up its economy, but remnants of this period still percolate in its internal politics and government operation to this day, including its ongoing antagonism toward India and its support of local jihadist groups, which the government uses as a counterbalance against India and other local power structures, which it can no longer face head-on. What I'd like to talk about today is a swirl of new tumult in modern-day Bangladesh, and what this moderate uproar might mean for the country's future. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. Learn more about Let's Know Things, subscribe to receive free email updates, and or become a supporter to receive monthly bonus episodes at letsknowthings.com. Modern Bangladesh is surrounded by conflict. Myanmar's military government is in the midst of a civil war following the recent overthrow of its democratically elected civilian government, and the subsequent rise of and loose collaboration between rebel groups in various parts of the country. India is booming and is broadly considered to be the next big power player on the world stage, though it's already a regional titan. It also continues to scuffle with Pakistan to its northwest and with China along its shared border, which is located just a short distance north of Bangladesh. Bangladesh's coast along the Bay of Bengal has long underperformed economically, despite being surrounded by some of the most impactful producers of goods in the world. And this coastline, including the one occupied by Bangladesh, has become incredibly unpredictable in recent years, regularly flooding, entire villages being swept out to sea, and freshwater sources increasingly tainted by those incursions of salt water. This area already has a lot going on, in other words, and many of those goings-on seem primed for amplification in the coming years, as global power structures and economic tangles continue to flex and break and rearrange, and as the climate continues to behave in increasingly distressing ways. There's a political and military realignment happening in this part of the world, but geopolitics and global economics are also swirling and rearranging in all sorts of unpredictable ways, all of which serves as context for a recent series of protests that arose around Bangladesh beginning in mid-July of 2024. These protests were held by mostly students who were not fans of a quota scheme that was originally implemented by the government in the wake of that 1974 war with Pakistan. This system abolished in 2018, but which was re-implemented by the country's high court shortly before these protests began. And this system basically promised that 30% of all government jobs would go to the descendants of people who fought in that war against Pakistan for independence, alongside some fewer jobs for minority groups, folks from traditionally underrepresented districts, and people who are disabled. Though again, this quota system was mostly meant to benefit the descendants of those veterans. The protesting students were pissed about this re-implementation because the country's economy is not great at the moment, and unemployment is rife. The jobs that are available are not paying much and are not terribly secure, and about 18 million young people are currently unemployed in Bangladesh. Government jobs, in contrast, tend to provide some level of consistency and predictability, pay relatively well, and they tend to stick around. Folks in such jobs are not worried about being fired or their jobs disappearing because of the very nature of those jobs. So the best employment opportunities by that standard are government jobs, and nearly a third of those jobs have been promised to people who, in many cases, just happen to be born to the right parents or grandparents. And notably, the majority of folks with families who fought in that conflict are also supporters of the party that runs the current authoritarian Bangladeshi government. So part of the criticism here is that these quotas offer a means of giving cushy, reliable jobs to supporters of the current regime without overtly seeming like that's what they're doing. These peaceful student protests were met with heavy resistance and violence by the government, which deployed police and soldiers who shot live rounds at protesters and shut down universities and the internet across the country. And that led to more protests, including by non-students, who were also met with, at times, deadly force. About 150 people have been confirmed killed so far, though that's the government's figure, and other independent counts have tallied more than 200 dead. Hundreds of protesters were also arrested, and curfews were implemented throughout the country. The Supreme Court responded to the initial protests by reducing the quota in late July to the point that about 5% of government jobs would go to descendants of those veterans and 2% to those other groups, which in practice meant that 93% of all government jobs would be divvied out in a normal way, hiring people based on who is the best candidate. Protests largely ceased after that announcement, and the government restored internet services 11 days after shutting it down across the country. Social media platforms like WhatsApp and TikTok remain restricted, however, as these services were used to promote and organize protests, and the government is still concerned that those could pop back up. Curfews have also been relaxed somewhat, though police are reportedly sweeping through schools and cities, grabbing people who were recorded as having been at protests, and arresting thousands of them, including at least a half-dozen students who led the initial protests that kicked everything off. Protest leaders are now demanding that the remaining curfews be lifted, that those who were arrested are released, charges against them dropped, and that the leaders responsible for the heavy-handed response to these protests should resign. Some protesters have also called for the country's prime minister, Sheikh Hasina, to step down, as she initially called the students traitors, though she later backtracked and said she did not want them to be harmed. Hasina is the longest-serving prime minister in Bangladesh's history, having initially stepped into the position in 1996, then stepping back into the role in 2009. She has held the office ever since. She is generally considered to be an authoritarian and has been accused of fixing elections, extrajudicial killings, and the imprisonment or worse of politicians and journalists who challenge her in any way. She is, given all that then, perhaps not surprisingly, blaming these protests not on the students, not any longer at least, but instead on opposition political parties, who she says are attempting to challenge her rule and thus are threatening the well-being of the country as a whole. Given that this is a relatively well-established authoritarian regime, there's a non-zero chance those who are in charge of these protests will take the win with the quota system, even though it wasn't fully removed, and step back from these other, more substantial demands that are unlikely to be met, short of perhaps a token resignation here and there by lower-rung government officials who decide to take the bullet for those higher up. Outside demands for impartial investigations into who caused what are likewise unlikely to move forward, and the government has made it pretty clear it intends to double down on the "it's the political opposition doing this to us and you" narrative, which could help them justify further clamping down on these groups, even to the point of more imprisonments and killing, and doing all of this in such a way that it makes dislodging the current ruling party even more difficult in the future. It is possible that tumult elsewhere around the world, including in Bangladesh's own backyard, might encourage overreaction, not underreaction from those in charge, as Myanmar's military government is having a lot of trouble with rebels these days. And while it's not impossible that the Prime Minister will give in to more moderate demands, publicly apologizing for the violent response and firing some of her higher-level ministers, her government's history hints that things are more likely to tilt in the other direction, at least for the foreseeable future, and at least if the protesters fail to scale up their operations to incorporate more of the country's population than they have thus far. A Myanmar-style uprising is not what they are seeing in Bangladesh, at least at this time. At the moment, then, things have calmed a bit in terms of protests and government responses to those protests in Bangladesh, but there are elements to this story that have made things even more volatile than they already were, and because of how uncertain so many variables in the region are right now, there's a chance we will see this, or connected movements and extended storylines, bubbling back up into the headlines at some point in the near future. The book I'd like to recommend today is called The Identity Trap: The Story of Ideas and Power in Our Time by Yascha Mounk. I found this book useful because it presented a lot of arguments that I initially disagreed with completely, but which, after having read the book, I found some gray area in, both in my existing understandings and arguments and in the arguments presented by the author. I'm still not 100% on the same page as this author, but I felt like the explanations and arguments were rational and cogent enough to be worth further consideration. And I do personally find that on all sides of the political and ideological spectrum, there's a whole lot of grouping and what we might loosely call identity politics, though I'm hesitant to use that term because of what it's become associated with. There are identity-based groupings that I think have made people less likely to think for themselves, have made people less likely to question the dogma of the group that they consider themselves to be a part of, and I think that this is overall harmful for democratic processes and other civic activities that we might otherwise healthily engage in. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of The Identity Trap by Yascha Mounk. You can subscribe to receive email updates, find show notes, and other such content, and support this show financially, receiving additional bonus episodes as a thank you at letsknowthings.com. Learn more about me and my work at Colin.io. Subscribe to my other news-focused podcast, One Sentence News, wherever you get your pods, or at onesentencenews.com. And say howdy on social media. I'm at Colin is my name on Instagram and Twitter, and Colin Wright on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Colin Wright, and I'll talk to you again next week.